Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War history. In this episode, we examine the tactically spectacular raid conducted by 36-year-old Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson, a pre-war music teacher from the Midwest. These raids kept the Confederates guessing and helped loosen the restraints held on U.S. Grant during the Vicksburg campaign. U.S. Grant, bogged down outside Vicksburg, needed a diversion to ease his way. He got just that from a music teacher turned cavalryman, one who hated horses at that. In the early months of 1863, Major General U.S. Grant's primary objective was Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. If that city could be taken, the North would control the entire river, splitting the Confederacy down the middle. Before Grant could take Vicksburg, however, he had to get there, which was proving to be a very annoying problem. Grant's 3 divisions were located well north of their target, on the wrong side of the Mississippi. Traveling directly downriver would require running rebel batteries at Vicksburg, something Grant was hesitant to try. But all other endeavors to advance southward, including 2 attempts to dig canals bypassing Vicksburg and 2 attempts to force passage through the swamps and bayous east of the river, had failed miserably. Finally, on the night of April 16th, ironclads and supply-laden transports steamed past the Vicksburg guns. Confederate cannons blasted away at the steam-driven fleet, but only a single transport was lost. Another successful run was completed on April 22nd. Grant's infantry had already marched south, and with supplies and river transports now plentiful, the Union Army could finally cross the watery barrier. A major part of Grant's plan was to distract the Confederate commander, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, while he crossed the river and swung around to approach Vicksburg from the east. Major General William T. Sherman played a part in the plan. His division remained north of Vicksburg, demonstrating against the Chickasaw Bluffs. The local Confederate commander sent a panicky message to Pemberton, claiming that the enemy are in front of me in such a force as never seen before at Vicksburg. Send me reinforcements. In reality, Sherman represented only about a third of Grant's command and probably could not have taken the bluffs if he tried. Nevertheless, Pemberton sent 3,000 troops that had been marching south to oppose Grant. Another diversion, one that would prove wildly successful, was a cavalry raid launched into Mississippi from the Grange, Tennessee, on April 17th. It was the beginning of the 16 days of nearly non-stop movement, widespread destruction, and frequent battle. When it was over, Grant would accurately describe it as one of the most brilliant cavalry exploits of the war. Grant had first considered such a raid as early as February of 1863, suggesting a volunteer force of 500 be used. As his strategy evolved, the importance of the raid increased. By mid-March, the strength of the raiders had been dramatically enlarged, and the volunteer stipulation had vanished. The man assigned to lead the raid was 36-year-old Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson, a pre-war music teacher from the Midwest who, in less violent times, had traveled to various small towns organizing amateur bands. Later, he went into the produce business and, in 1860, wrote campaign songs for Abraham Lincoln. When the war began, Grierson enlisted as a private in the infantry. He very much wanted to do his share of the fighting on foot. While a child, he had been kicked in the face by a horse and still harbored a severe dislike for the equine creatures. In May of 1862, Grierson was commissioned a major in the 6th Illinois Cavalry. A man with little military training or experience and a pronounced dislike of horses, would soon prove to be one of the most skilled cavalry leaders of the war. The raid began at dawn on the 17th. Grierson rode south from the Grange with 1,700 men. Colonel Reuben Loomis, 6th Illinois Cavalry, Colonel Edward Prince's 7th Illinois Cavalry, and Colonel Edward Hatch's 2nd Iowa Cavalry, along with a battery of 6 two-pounders. Grierson alone knew the extent of the orders: to penetrate deep into the rebel-held state, cut Pemberton's supply line, and then return to Union lines by whatever route seemed best. To guide him, Grierson brought a compass and a pocket map of Mississippi. They moved quickly, covering 30 miles on the first day. During the afternoon of the 18th, they crossed the Tallahatchie River at 3 separate points. A battalion of the 7th Illinois was the first to meet opposition. Crossing at the New Albany, they encountered Southern troops attempting to destroy the bridge. The Illinoisans advanced and were fired on. They pressed forward, and the outnumbered rebels were forced to run. The bridge was repaired, and the crossing made. 6 miles farther up the Tallahatchie, Hatch's 2nd Iowa also met the enemy, numbering about 200. Hatch fought skirmishes that day, and the next morning, armed with Colt revolving rifles, Hatch's men emerged victorious, taking a number of prisoners. After a night of torrential rains, the command reformed on April 19th and continued south to Pontotoc, where they burned a mill and again skirmished with Confederate soldiers. Dawn of April 20th found the Northerners 80 miles inside Confederate territory, with Grierson forming his men for inspection. He called out 175 men suffering from dysentery and saddle galls. Calling themselves the Quinine Brigade, these men escorted the prisoners back through Pontotoc that night, in the hopes of convincing the Confederates that the entire command was returning to Tennessee. Grierson himself continued south with the 2 Illinois regiments, while the 2nd Iowa and the two-pounder broke off and turned eastward the next morning, with orders to cut the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Hatch's men arrived at Palo Alto that afternoon, drawing Confederate cavalry away from Grierson. Hatch was met by Lieutenant Colonel C.R. Bartow's 2nd Tennessee Cavalry. A skirmish ensued, and the Iowans' revolving rifles again gave them a decided advantage. Hatch retreated north along the railroad, with Bartow in close pursuit. He destroyed the rails at the Okolana and the Tupelo. Bartow caught him again near Birmingham on April 24th. After a 2-hour battle, Hatch retreated across Camp Creek and burned the bridge behind him. Bartow, his men exhausted and his ammunition running low, gave up the pursuit. Hatch returned to LaGrange on April 26th, his diversion within a diversion a roaring success. He brought with him 600 horses and mules, with about 200 able-bodied civilians to lead them, and claimed 100 Confederate casualties while losing only 10 himself. Grierson, in the meantime, had not been idle. Hatch had drawn away what little cavalry the Confederates had to field in northern Mississippi. Most had been detached to General Braxton Bragg in Tennessee, and Grierson's 950 remaining men could gallop south without worries of pursuit from the rear. They entered Starkville about 4 p.m. on the 21st, capturing and destroying government property. Just south of town, Grierson detached another unit to operate independently. The 7th Illinois, Company B, under Captain Henry Forbes, moved east, then galloped south down the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. They raided Macon, and despite the tiny size of his command, Forbes demanded that the town of Enterprise surrender to him. Not surprisingly, rebel troops there refused, and Forbes moved on to rejoin Grierson at the Pearl River. By now, the Confederates were desperate to stop the Union raiders. Thanks to Hatch, Forbes and the Quinine Brigade, Pemberton was receiving confused and exaggerated reports of Grierson's strength and position. Lacking sufficient cavalry, he was diverting more and more infantry from Vicksburg and Grand Gulf, where Grant was preparing to cross. An infantry brigade marching to Vicksburg from Alabama was halted at Meridian. 3 regiments and supporting artillery were sent to Morton against the possibility that Grierson might turn toward Jackson, Pemberton's headquarters. Routes north and northwest were blocked by troops at Okalona, Canton, and Carthage. Troops as far away as Port Hudson, Louisiana, were mobilized against the hard-riding former music teacher. All was to no avail. It was the swift-footed cavalry against slow-plodding infantry. It was impossible for the Confederates to effectively close in on Grierson's men. Leaving Starkville, Grierson moved south toward Louisville, Mississippi. His Illinoisans pushed through a swamp, a dismal swamp nearly belly-deep in mud, as Grierson later described it, and swam their horses across streams. He detached a battalion to destroy a large tannery and shoe factory. The battalion succeeded, doing an estimated $50,000 in damage. They pressed on, still moving with no road visible, through the swamp and water of the Nooksby River bottom, arriving at Louisville after sunset on the 22nd. Grierson threw out 2 battalions as pickets, bottling up the citizens to prevent any information about his route from getting out. Still, he showed real concern that Southern civilians and their property be protected, as the orders to the pickets included instructions to drive out stragglers, preserve order, and quiet the fears of the people. Considering the behavior of many Union soldiers regarding the South during the war, such concerns were not unfounded. Grierson, though, could later write with justifiable pride that they, the Southerners, were protected in their persons and their property. His men passed through Louisville without incident. They soon struck another swamp and lost several horses to drowning. By midnight, they had reached a plantation 10 miles south of town, halting there until daybreak. They moved past Philadelphia, resting again until 10 o'clock that night. 2 battalions of the 7th Illinois then moved on, ordered to pass through Decatur and hit the Southern Railroad at Newton Station, a major supply junction due east of Vicksburg. Grierson followed with the main column an hour later. Preceding everyone, including the 2-point battalions, were 9 men clad in Confederate uniforms. These volunteer Illinoisians, under the command of Sergeant Richard Serby, had been designated the Butternut Guerillas and were to prove their value as scouts again and again during the raid. This day they seized a telegraph station, preventing a warning of Grierson's approach. Grierson arrived at Newton Station around 6 a.m. The advanced battalion seized the hamlet and captured 2 trains. The main column soon joined them. Here was property of legitimate military value, and Grierson had no qualms about laying waste. 2 locomotives, 25 freight cars filled with commissary stores and ammunition, including artillery shells intended for the garrison at Vicksburg, were burned, along with additional stores and 500 muskets found in town. A battalion from the 6th Illinois rode east, destroying bridges, trestle works, and telegraph wire. 75 prisoners were taken, but were soon paroled. Several men found and inevitably helped themselves to a supply of whiskey, but all were ready to move out by 2 p.m. The Federals continued south, soon reaching Garlandville. Here they were met by shotgun-wielding civilians, many of them, wrote Grierson, venerable with age. The Illinoisians were fired upon, and 1 man was wounded. A quick charge broke up the untrained Southerners, capturing several. According to Grierson, the prisoners were apologetic, acknowledging their mistake, and declared that they had been grossly deceived as to our real character. One volunteered his service as a guide, and upon leaving us declared that hereafter his prayers should be for the Union Army. Grierson used this as a sample of the attitudes he encountered among civilians during the raid, describing the hundreds who were skulking and hiding out to avoid conscription, only to await the presence of our arms to sustain them, when they will rise up and declare their principles, and thousands who have been deceived upon validation of our cause would immediately return to loyalty. To a point, the attitudes of the civilians of Garlandville must be taken with a grain of salt. They were, after all, surrounded by heavily armed soldiers whom they had very recently shot at, and were thus liable to be disagreeable. Still, such dissension did exist in the South throughout the war. Poverty, food shortages, government policies that unfairly favored large plantation owners over poor farmers, destruction of homes and livelihoods, all this was stripping away loyalty to the Confederacy for many Southerners. The people of Garlandville had been willing to fight to defend their homes, but once they discovered the raiders meant them no harm, the obligation to bear arms against them disappeared. This was not really, as Grierson implied, due to any latent loyalty to the Union, but was rather part of the quite human desire to keep a roof over one's head and a moderate amount of food in one's stomach. That bugle call means it's time for this week's book recommendation. This week's recommendation is Grierson's Raid, a daring cavalry strike through the heart of the Confederacy by Tom Lilicki. In April of 1863, Colonel Benjamin Grierson, a daring, resourceful officer, led a series of wildly successful raids from Grange, Tennessee, to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, damaging a major Confederate rail line, disrupting communications, and destroying enemy supply lines. It was a campaign that diverted the attention of Confederate commanders from the Union's successful attack on Vicksburg, a major defeat for the Confederacy. Lilicki recounts the raids in day-by-day detail, combining background information on the various participants with action scenes. The use of first-hand accounts brings the events vividly to life in a way that makes the book read more like an adventure story than a history text. Black and white photographs, maps, and reproductions of newspaper headlines will help readers visualize the story. Accessibly written and thoroughly researched, this book will be particularly appealing to Civil War buffs and researchers alike. The raiders rode another 12 miles, stopping that night on a plantation belonging to Dr. Macadora, 50 miles from the Newton station. Newton had been the primary tactical objective of the raid. After leaving there, Grierson had complete discretion as to his route and final destination. The ride south through Garlandville had been to find a spot to rest and forage. His men would not be on the move again until the morning of the 26th. In the meantime, the Butternut guerrillas were out gathering information about Confederate troop dispositions. One of the scouts, dressed as a civilian, turned north back toward the Southern Railroad to cut the telegraph and perhaps burn a bridge or trestle work. 7 miles from the tracks, he ran into a regiment of rebel cavalry from Brandon, searching for Grierson. They were riding directly toward the Macadora plantation, but the quick-thinking scout bluffed them. Claiming to have seen the raiders recently, he sent the horsemen galloping off in the wrong direction. Grierson soon learned that Pemberton had been reinforcing Jackson and points east with infantry and artillery. He decided to move southwest, crossing the Pearl River and hitting the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad at Hazelhurst. From there, he would flank Confederate forces and eventually join Grant at Grand Gulf. Pemberton, though, had finally guessed correctly regarding Grierson's intentions. He ordered Major General John Bowen, commander of the Grand Gulf Garrison, to detach 7 Mississippi cavalry companies to intercept the raiders. This, in turn, further weakened Bowen, who would soon be meeting Grant's far superior force in battle. Pemberton was in a no-win situation. He could hardly allow 1,000 enemy troops to romp around behind his lines, but the only way to stop them was by diverting men from strategically vital areas. By now, there was more than a division's worth of troops scattered about the state, hoping to stop Grierson. This, of course, was the primary objective of the raid, beyond damaging Pemberton's supply line. Rested and reprovisioned, the raiders set out again at 6 a.m. on April 26th. They crossed the Leaf River, burning the bridge behind them. Arriving at Raleigh, they captured the county sheriff and confiscated $3,000 in cash, and then stopped for the night at Westville. On April 27th, the Butternut guerrillas were again dressed in Confederate uniforms. Moving ahead of the main column, they seized a ferryboat on the Pearl River, presenting Grierson with an easy method of crossing. Reunited here with Ford's B Company, the raiders moved on to Hazelhurst. Here a string of boxcars was burned, but the flames spread to nearby buildings, and suddenly the whole town was in danger of going up. Grierson set his men to work alongside the townspeople, fighting to save Hazelhurst. A hard rain fell that night, helping to contain the blaze. It was not until well after dark that the Illinoisans could move on. Now their course was due west, toward Grand Gulf. They continued west on the 28th. A battalion from the 7th Illinois was detached to double back to the railroad, destroying rails, telegraph wire, and government property. The main column stopped at the plantation that afternoon, but the break did not prove restful. Without warning, the pickets were fired upon, and rebel horsemen charged forward, their sudden attack panicking many of the Illinoisians. Grierson led a counterattack, and the Southerners, consisting merely of 2 understrength companies, were pushed back. The Federals kept pushing, driving the rebels through the nearby town of Union Church and occupying it that night. The detached battalion rejoined them there. The attackers were part of Colonel Wirt Adams' command, the Mississippi cavalrymen detached from Grand Gulf. The bulk of Adams's men were west of Union Church, waiting to ambush Grierson. A Butternut guerrilla again saved the day, riding ahead in disguise and speaking with some of the Mississippians. Warned of the ambush, Grierson changed his plans. He made a brief demonstration to the west, then doubled back to the east. His final destination was now Baton Rouge. His men would have to ride an extra 100 miles, but the decision was unavoidable. Adams pursued, staying on Grierson's tail as far south as Greensburg, Louisiana. 500 armed citizens and conscripts awaited the raiders at Brookhaven, a town astride the Great Northern Railroad 20 miles south of Hazelhurst. The raiders charged into town, quickly ending resistance. The town proved to be a camp of instruction, which would nowadays be called boot camp. Prisoners were paroled, and the camp, along with the railroad and the telegraph, was destroyed. Once again, flames jumped onto civilian buildings, and once again, despite the loss of precious time, Grierson's men helped to save a town. The raiders turned south, riding 8 more miles before making camp at a plantation. Elsewhere, on the 29th, William Sherman was carrying out his demonstration near Chickasaw Bluffs. Farther south, Union gunboats spent 6 hours bombarding Grant Gulf in preparation of Grant's crossing, but the Confederate positions remained intact. Grant was forced to move again, intending now to cross at undefended Bruinsburg. The raiders continued south on April 30th, destroying bridges, water tanks, and trestle works, and burning the depot and 15 cars at Bogchitos Station. They reached Summit as sunset neared. Grierson ordered the destruction of 25 freight cars and a large cache of government sugar, but spared the depot itself. He did not want to risk a fire again spreading into town, and he could not afford to lose more time while his men fought the blaze. Grierson ordered his men to remount. Some were a bit unsteady in the saddle after discovering a supply of rum, and made 6 more miles before camping. On May 1st, they turned west, then south, making a straight line for Baton Rouge, and let speed be our safety, as Grierson phrased it. The raiders were to cover 76 miles in the next 28 hours. They neared Magnolia and later Osaka, but both towns were bypassed because they contained enemy troops. About noon, they reached Wall's Bridge across the Tickfall River. 3 companies of the 9th Tennessee Cavalry greeted them there. Grierson's lead company suffered 8 casualties, accounting for nearly all of the battle losses he suffered throughout the raid. But the Illinoisians pressed their attack against their outnumbered foe. The Confederate pickets were captured. Then Grierson's artillery rumbled up and shelled the enemy position across the river. A charge swept the bridge and sent the Tennesseans running, leaving a number of dead, wounded, and captured comrades behind. The enemy were now on our track in earnest, wrote Grierson. Captured dispatches told them that rebel troops were closing in from all sides. He continued to gallop south, riding all night, pushing his exhausted men to their limits. They crossed the Amite River at Williams Bridge at night, 2 hours ahead of a heavy column of infantry and artillery. By now, the Confederates had plenty else to keep them occupied. Grant's troops crossed the Mississippi on May 1st and were moving up to take Grand Gulf from the rear. Bowen moved 6,000 available troops to Port Gibson, intercepting Grant. But the unfortunate Bowen, stripped of his cavalry and having no reinforcements, was outnumbered 4-1. He fought all day, inflicting a disproportionate number of casualties, but was inevitably forced to retreat and abandon Port Gibson. Grant, at last, had a secure bridgehead on the east side of the Mississippi. Grierson's men reached Sandy Creek at dawn on May 2nd, surprising and capturing a Southern cavalry unit camped there. The camp, with 150 tents, plus guns, ammunition, and documents, was destroyed. The raiders kept going, surprising another cavalry unit at Roberts Ford across the Comanche River. After a brief skirmish, 40 rebels were captured, along with their horses and equipment. They forded the river, with many of the horses forced to swim across the deep water. The men reached their limit 6 miles short of Baton Rouge. Grierson called a halt, letting them sleep alongside the river. Grierson himself wound down by playing a piano found in a nearby plantation house, but was interrupted by a picket shouting that they were about to be overrun by rebels coming at them from the west. Grierson guessed the identity of the approaching men and rode out to meet them. As he suspected, they were Union cavalry from Baton Rouge riding out to meet the raiders. Grierson's exhausted and filthy troops rode into the Louisiana capital at 3 p.m., greeted by cheering soldiers and civilians alike. They paraded around the public square, then found a magnolia grove south of town where they could simply collapse and catch up on 2 weeks' worth of sleep. Grierson's raiders had traveled more than 600 miles in 16 days, virtually without rest and often limited to 1 hastily eaten meal per day. 100 Confederates had been killed or wounded, and another 500 had been captured, most of whom were later paroled. The raiders destroyed more than 50 miles of railroad and telegraph, 3,000 stand of arms, and thousands of dollars worth of supplies and property. 1,000 mules and horses were also captured. In addition, they had tied up virtually all of Pemberton's cavalry, 1/3 of his infantry, and at least 2 regiments of artillery. All this was accomplished at the cost of only 3 dead and 7 wounded. 5 men too sick to continue had been left behind, and 9 men, presumed stragglers, were missing. The 7th Illinois surgeon and sergeant major stayed behind with a mortally wounded officer at Wall's Bridge. Adding to Hatch's losses, the casualties numbered 36, only about 2% of the total command. Grierson was quite justified when he later remarked, "The Confederacy is a hollow shell. Rebels in Mississippi, as everywhere else in the South, were spread too thin to do their jobs." Grierson suddenly and uncomfortably discovered he was a hero. "I, like Byron," he wrote to his wife, Alice, "have had to wake up one morning and find myself famous." He was sent by steamboat to New Orleans, where he encountered one continuous ovation. His picture was featured on the covers of Harper's Weekly and Leslie's Illustrated. He was breveted to brigadier general and later major general of volunteers. Grierson continued to serve with distinction, commanding first a division, then a cavalry corps in Tennessee. Despite his continued distrust of horses, he remained in the regular army after the war, battling Indians as a colonel with the 10th U.S. Cavalry. He retired as a brigadier general in 1890 and died in 1911. Following the raid, Grant continued to advance eastward. Joined by Sherman's division, he now had 40,000 men in Mississippi. Pemberton had 30,000, but many of them were scattered across the state, and he lacked time to concentrate his forces. Bowen was forced to abandon Grand Gulf, and Grant was virtually unopposed as he marched to Jackson, burning that city, and then swung west to besiege Vicksburg. He advanced with a supply line. Grierson had helped to demonstrate that troops could live off the land, appropriating food from farms and plantations as they progressed. It was a lesson dramatically learned and daringly taught that others would study in the flame-darkened days to come. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.